The train trip. I've been on trains before, in New York, in Europe, but never like this. This was a lark, an adventure for the young at heart, for the sure of foot, and the crazy. Having backpacked for years, my husband Paul and I figured that we would take on the challenge. Our friends Blair and Sandy invited us to join them and their friends, a loosely knit group of adults in their 20s and 30s, on a train ride. These people were a motley collection of train freaks from Berkeley who had hopped freights from Washington to Utah and made a new sport out of train riding. One of the lawyers in the group, Bob, had worked on trains years before and was to be our leader on this adventure. It was midnight when we arrived at the Stockton and Railroad yards. Our teeth chattered in the cold air as we pulled our sleeping bags, coolers filled with food, and backpacks out of our cars and peered into the yard. Suddenly, the ground began to shake, and an arcing beam pierced the black, followed by mysterious, towering boxcars which looked as if they were 2 stories high, a steamroller bearing down on us, rumbling, thundering with a loud foghorn blast. I backed away from these intimidating forms looming overhead, shaking and clacking as they roared past. Somehow, a freight train at night has an eerie, fearsome quality. Our group of travelers, 18 of us, turned our attention to Bob, who was standing in the middle of the now empty yard with a train yard phone in his hand. We didn't have cell phones in those days. While we huddled in the cold, watching, Bob crouched over the phone and listened for the arrival and departure times of various freight trains. Within 10 or 15 minutes, 2 freight trains had arrived in the yard to refuel. One was a gondola which carried new cars and pickup trucks in tiers. The other was called a piggyback or flat car, which carried the trailers usually towed by semi-trucks. Veteran riders pointed to their choice of cars and then, with hoots and hollers by ones and twos, broke into a run and climbed onto the gondola cars. Once on, they quickly hauled their coolers and bags into the flat car and climbed into pickup trucks. A funny irony, riding trucks on a train. Our friends Blair and Sandy, who had ridden trains before, were more discriminating riders, and instead of joining the gondola group, ran with us in tow to the second train with the piggybacks. There we found a section of the flat car which was empty, threw our gear in, and climbed aboard. The other half was occupied by a huge mail truck trailer anchored by a hitch. I was breathless, afraid the train would start up just as we were climbing aboard. At that point, I knew I should have stayed home. And I sat down on the cold plank floor, shaking with cold and nervousness. Paul suggested we tie our sleeping bags onto our wrists, just in case. Then we organized our coolers and bags around us and lay down on the open flat car just as the train started with a jerk. At first it moved slowly, and we opened our sleeping bags on the wide flat boards with large cracks in between. Those boards were all that separated us from the tracks below. The sides of the flat car rose only about 12 inches on its sides, a poor windbreak. As the train picked up speed, our voices were all but sucked up into the torrent of noise. I felt all the fear of being helplessly carried along by this whirlwind, unable to control it. It seemed more like 500 miles than 90 or so an hour. All of a sudden, Paul yelled as his sleeping bag flew into the air over our heads. The only thing keeping it from blowing off the train was the little string tied to Paul's wrist. We all laughed, hauling the bag in like a huge parachute. I finally settled down to a pounding, swaying ride, accustoming myself to its rhythm as it screamed through the night, as Paul would say, like a bat out of hell. Only the periodic clanging of bells at the grade crossings broke the relentless rhythm and then died away. The next thing I knew, it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and the train was clacking and chugging haltingly up a steep grade in the Sierra foothills. By the time the sun rose, our group was sitting on our bags, eating boiled eggs and cinnamon rolls while gazing over the entire Portola Valley. The train moving slowly, as if it knew we wanted to savor the scene below, with farmhouses, orchards, variegated crops dotting the landscape. I can still see that vista, now many years later, and remember my happiness and contentment that morning. It was a spiritual moment where I was transported to paradise, a miniature natural world, as the four of us silently meditated and ate. At about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, our train pulled into the Portola station. Paul and I had just time to jump down with our gear and swing the large coolers over the car's side before it took off again. We started walking, but gladly accepted a ride in the back of a truck to the local park where we found a campsite. It was hours before the rest of the gang on the slow train dragged into camp, but once everyone was settled at the campsite, fires were lit and soon wine bottles were opened and passed, and we all became more friendly and intimate. Steaks and hamburgers were sizzling on the wood fires while revelers shared stories of their ride into the mountains. After dinner, we talked and sang long into the night, enjoying the fire. The next morning, we woke up in time to eat a quick breakfast and pack up for the train adventure home. We must have been a sight. 18 people leaning against the train station wall, sitting on the sidewalk with backpacks, reading the papers. We spent the next hour climbing an abandoned caboose, balancing on the tracks to see who could stay on the longest, sharing train stories until our train came to a stop. This time we found an empty flat car and all climbed aboard the same one. We were warned to put our coolers along the edge of the car to duck behind at train crossings in case street urchins decided to hurl stones. It was a hot, sunny trip back, a happy contrast to the night ride, with the 18 of us lounging on deck chairs, standing or sitting on the planked floor as we rumbled through small farm towns and waved at staring motorists and pedestrians, the bells clanging and the traffic arms descending for our train. The scenery sped by and we sang, talked, waved at gawkers, and drank cold drinks. We only had to duck stones at one crossing. I was relaxed this time, loudly joining in the singing and talking and feeling confident enough to stand on the moving flat car and still enjoy the beauty of the countryside as we jolted and careened along. At times I felt like a miniature in a model train scene. Little trains in the distance, curving along the mountain, then seeming to collide with our train, only to come out on the other side of the underpass. As the train neared Stockton in the early hours of the evening, Bob told us the train would not come to a complete stop, but it would slow down in the yards. As the sun set and the train rumbled across the yard at 5 miles an hour, we began to jump off. The guys would jump first and then run alongside the train while the girls balanced the coolers on the edge of the side. Then the guys would grab them and continue running while the girls threw their bags out and jumped. As I leaped, I hit the track adjacent to ours and turned my ankle. But it wasn't too painful and I limped my way back safely. After farewell hugs, the group broke up for the trip home. We had made many good friends on this trip. The same year, Santa Fe tightened its rules and no longer allowed free rides. With that went one of the greatest pastimes and simplest thrills I've ever experienced.